we're waiting for a couple more people to come in, but good afternoon. Welcome to the Wilson Center. So I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, Director of Population, Environmental Security and Resilience here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And it's good to have such a good turnout for this topic, sort of looking at three great ideas that were not on the agenda looking back at the UN General Assembly process. And I was teasing my colleagues as we were planning for this event. I said, we have three great items, three great ideas, but we have four panelists. So we'll be looking to link these issues a little bit. So those of you who are coming in, yes, please feel free to come up to the front. And as many of you know, we at the Woodrow Wilson Center serve as a living memorial to President Wilson. And in his legacy, we bring together analysis, policy, and practice. And this is one component of today's panel that I'm really looking forward to, because we're going to be looking at the discussions coming out of New York and the General Assembly, and what it means for sort of the general development goals moving forward, and to address some gaps and directions and where we could move forward. And we thought, as we planned for that it was going to be important to make sure that we were all on the same page in terms of this process that has been taking place for the past few months. So we're going to start our conversation with a friend and colleague, Etienne Sosaro from Population Action International. And Etienne is actually going to start by explaining for us a little bit the process leading up to the General Assembly discussions and what will come next. And then she's going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that she works on. So Etienne, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Roger Mark. Thank you. My name's Etienne Scazzaro with Population Action International, and like Roger Mark said, I wanted to start off with this question of what is the post-2015 development agenda all about, and really contextualize part of the conversation that we'll be having here today. So the post-2015 development agenda has been underway, as many of you know, for almost 18 months at this point, let's say 2 years. And it's really drawing upon a long history of events that have been taking place over the past several decades. So the Rio Earth Summit brought out Agenda 21, a voluntary, non-binding convention around sustainable development that really set the tone for what the conversation about sustainable development at the UN would look like. The International Conference on Population and Development had the Program of Action, which articulated a bold vision about the role of reproductive health and rights as part of being pivotal to development as well. The Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000 are what we're building off of for post-2015. So there were 8 development goals that were outlined that will be expiring in 2015. And we're here to have the conversation about what the next set of development goals will look like. The MDGs, according to their website, are acclaimed to be the most successful global anti-poverty push in history. And we hope to continue the momentum of that success through some of the conversations that are taking place. So why is it important? Why have hundreds of civil society groups been participating in these conversations for 20 years? This is because we are discussing the lives and livelihoods of people around the world, and that poverty alleviation remains the center of development. And the conversation about sustainable development goals is that our use of natural resources is critical to those livelihoods. And so how we use and treat the earth has become an increasing part of that conversation. Because we want to get it right the first time. For instance, in 2000, there was no reference to reproductive health in the conversation. And so it was not until 2005 when Target 5B was put into place that reflected reproductive health as part of the Millennium Development Goals. So we want to make sure that all of the important pieces of the agenda are part of the conversation from the get-go in post-2015. And because it's important for us to reworking off the same roadmap. The conversations have been very aspirational, very visionary in where we hope to go. And in order to have a roadmap to work towards that vision is something that will make us collectively stronger in the action that we take. So many of you may have already seen this. This is a resource from the UN Foundation, which outlines the post-2015 development agenda through 2015. So as you can see, there's already been many processes underway, consultations and open working groups and the sustainable development financing conversations. And so you'll see that we're here at the SG synthesis report is the next seminal piece that will be coming out in November of 2015. That's really going to be synthesizing many of these different processes moving forward to start a negotiation process across all member states. These conversations are not taking place in silos. So you'll see the climate change negotiations are happening in tandem, but influencing and informing some of the decision-making around the post-2015 as well. So what are these transformative shifts? Well over a year ago now, in June 2013, the high-level panel of eminent persons, including our own John Podesta, put forward 5 transformative shifts. So the Millennium Development Goals are expiring, and what is the opportunity to think differently about development? And these 5 transformative shifts, I think, remain central to the conversation and people's thinking around what innovation looks like and how to really reach all vulnerable populations. So you'll see the 5 listed here. The first is leave no one behind. And this is the idea that when you talk about reducing poverty by half, that you may only be reaching those easiest to reach. And we need to be reaching vulnerable populations, rural populations, women, disabled communities, indigenous communities, and that building goals that reflect that kind of nuance is critical. Putting sustainable development at the core is an exciting transition. It is the opportunity to recognize that while poverty alleviation remains the foundation of development and really the end goal for this work, that sustainable development is not only a piece of the conversation, but at the core of what the goals may look like. The other transformative shifts are transforming economies for jobs, building peace and effective, open, and accountable institutions for all. So the idea that peace and governance is not a conversation that just happens with the UN Security Council, but is something that's central to development, and that if you want to have sustainable development, that having a peaceful society with strong governing systems is critical to that. Forging a new global partnership, that this isn't something that an army of civil servants and government and civil society are tasked with, but that the private sector must be involved, that financing must be creative, and that to really get to the level and scale that we want for this goal, that we need to be thinking creatively about new and innovative partnerships and engaging everyone in the conversation. A data revolution. Again, a coined term that's been tossed around a lot and really relevant is that we have a ton of data. We're missing a ton of data. We need to disaggregate that data, but most of all, we need to have data-informed decision-making. So when we move to means of implementation of any and all of these goals, that we have the data that will be informing that decision-making, both baseline data and measurable benchmarks for any given goal and target. So this is also reiterated a year later in the co-chairs report from the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals. And they reiterate that the Sustainable Development Goals should be action-oriented, concise, easy to communicate, limited in number, aspirational, global in nature and universally applicable to all countries. So I think it reiterates the themes that we are thinking in a transformative way, and the universal piece is significant in that it is these goals, the intention will be that they will be universally applied to all countries, and while not binding, the construct of the goals will not be only relevant to the least developed countries, but also to all countries of all socioeconomic status and of different institutional construct as well. So relevant in a really creative way to a lot of different environments. So a brief summary of the open working group, which concluded over the summer, that was just recognized to be the foundation of what the synthesis report is expected to reflect. This is the Secretary General's report. And one of the main reasons that this is really the basis for the Secretary General's report is because it was so inclusive. So it reflected the views of 70 member states in 30 seats, in 30 shared seats. So there was already collaborative conversation between, for instance, the US, Canada, and Israel, or the G77 weighed in, the SIDS weighed in, the African Union and other global entities were part of the conversation. Even groups like, or countries like Sweden, who were not part of the 70 initial countries, were attending some of the open working group sessions and participating and informing some of the conversations and ultimately the outcome document as well. So it was an incredibly inclusive process that many member states were a part of. And the outcome report reflects that very comprehensive set of goals and targets. So there were 17 goals and 169 targets, which, if you remember from the previous slide, the idea of having a set of goals that are limited in number, this is far more than the 8 goals that came out of the Millennium Development Goals. So there's an understanding that over the course of the next year, year and a half, that this number will need to be parsed down quite a bit to perhaps 10 goals and quite a few less targets. But it's a good starting point for the conversation. So in the 11th hour of the open working group's last session before they adopted the final report, there were 4 sticking points that are reflected in the conversation we're having today. One was sexual and reproductive health and rights. The other was climate and energy subsidies, peace and governance, and means of implementation. So I think my co-panelists will be addressing each of those topics in a bit more detail. But just to say, some of these are newly controversial, some are deep-seated controversies or sticking points that have sustained themselves over many years and many different political nuances. I think the climate piece, if we think about sustainable development, is fundamental to include in any conversation about sustainable development, that if we're really thinking about having a relevant, forward-looking, aspirational set of goals, that climate change needs to be addressed at the forefront of that discussion. I would also say that sexual and reproductive health and rights, if we're thinking about the inclusion of women and gender equality, is relevant to this conversation. So interesting, too, that we're here at the Wilson Center at the Environment Change and Security Program, which addresses pretty squarely all of these issues that many of us in the room think are pivotal to advancing a progressive democratic agenda. The means of implementation is actually the 17th goal in the Sustainable Development Goals that was outlined by the Open Working Group, and one of the sticking points in that is the idea that balancing the prescriptiveness of how you implement an agenda. So when you're thinking of something that's a universal set of goals, whether the implementation of that should be left up to the national governments or whether it should be incorporated in a more prescriptive way, included in the goals and targets. So where did SRHR shake out in this? Sexual and reproductive health and rights, the community, many women advocates have been strongly advocating for this to sustain itself as part of the goals, and I would say it was a big success so far. There was an inclusion in both the health goal and the gender goal of universal access to sexual and reproductive health care services. That said, there's still more work to be done. We want to make sure that sexual rights are also recognized and that youth and adolescent access to services are also recognized. And so the Women's Major Group and other advocates are, as well as many member states that are advocates for this agenda, have been vocal in ensuring that the access to universal sexual and reproductive health and rights is sustained and strong and relevant in a very forward-looking way that not only includes the ICPD's program of action, which was written in 1994, but that looks at what the next, up until 2030, what are the needs of the LGBT community and the youth communities that will be reflected in the next decade. Another piece that PAI works on is thinking about how SRHR fits into a larger conversation. So when we think about the how are we going to be implementing this work? That integration of many of these goals will be critical to that. Just this past week, at the UN General Assembly, there were two big events that were relevant to this conversation. One was the ICPD's special session. And then the next was the Climate Summit, both of which took place at the UN in the exact same room with one on a Monday, one on a Tuesday, with entirely different negotiators and staff who were experts and steeped in representing their country in a really strong way, but not communicating with one another. So as you can see up here on the left, Andrew Revkin just this past week in the New York Times reflected on that and said, on the path past 9 billion, little crosstalk between the UN sessions on population and global warming. And we see that as a very big missed opportunity, and something that, with recognizing that women are 14 times more vulnerable to climate impacts, and that with drought and natural disasters hitting women the hardest, that access to family planning and reproductive health is critical to resilience. So as Revkin said, family planning should absolutely be seen as a climate resilience strategy in poor regions. And that opportunity to have that conversation continues to be missed in these more formal channels. And we hope that moving forward, that the means of implementation of the SDGs will reflect that. This photo here is from last week's Climate March, People's Climate March for Justice, that brought in, I think, 400,000 participants from around the world. And the tents represent survivors, so people who have already migrated and are in tents are climate refugees, moving from their homes and their livelihoods to other regions of the world due to climate impact. And just to say that this is happening now, climate is impacting communities around the world, and that mainstreaming sustainable development, as recognized by Rio Plus 20, would be a critical piece in advancing an agenda that addresses these marginalized populations. And what are we doing about it? Well, as advocates at PAI, we're part of an alliance called the Population and Sustainable Development Alliance, which is an alliance of 13 member organizations from both the global north and south that are advocating for the integration of both population dynamics, sexual and reproductive health and rights, women's equality, as they pertain to sustainable development in the post-2015 development agenda. Just last week, we heard from 3 of our partners, one in Malawi, DEPA, who works with an environmental organization that has, halfway through their project, realized that, while speaking with women, that the family planning and health needs were not being met, and that in order for their program to be most successful, that they needed to be fulfilling these needs for women as it pertained to environment. We also heard from Carolyn from Blue Ventures in Madagascar, a conservation organization where a volunteer joined for a scuba diving vacation, and as a medical doctor saw the needs in the community, trained some of the doctors, and they just graduated their first midwife for the community. And the last story that we heard from was from Joanne in the Philippines, where we know it was hit hardest by the tragic typhoon in 2013. And through integrated funding from both the environment and the health ministries, they've been able to really restore some of their work. So these are the stories that we're trying to lift up to the UN to recognize that this work is possible, that integration is possible, yes, and that by leaning on these stories that we're able to really capitalize on the knowledge of the folks on the ground to inform decision making and to really bring this work to scale as it pertains to the Sustainable Development Goals. So just to close, what can we do moving forward? I think the two pieces that at PAI we're really interested in seeing is having women at the center of development. And that means, in order for women to be engaged in development, to have access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. And that is relevant to resilience. That resilience is a pivotal part of our work, and that we really need to be considering it as it reaches vulnerable populations. So I'll leave you with the quote, "If you must err, do so on the side of audacity." So while we are collectively working towards unknown terrain, that we should be visionary in our work, ambitious, and audacious in where we hope to go. So, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Etienne. I think it was very helpful to sort of have that perspective on the process, taking us from the MDGs and that process being considered among some circles as a very successful poverty push, looking at poverty alleviation at the center of development. I particularly like your term, we're working on lives and livelihoods. I think that's a nice catchphrase. Some of the things that you mentioned, I think, as an advocate, saying that it was very important for us to think about how collectively we can be powerful and working off of the same roadmap. I think it was very good to also see that mention and this thinking with regard to transformative shifts and data-informed decision-making and these sort of 4 sticking points around SRHR, climate change, peace and governance, and means of implementation. I do want to take a moment to see if there are any clarification questions for Etienne on that process, because there's a lot there. There's a lot that has happened. And I know when I work with my colleagues internationally who were charged with either negotiating or reporting on behalf of their country, it was very often confusing for them. They thought it was a little bit dizzying and they weren't quite sure how to position themselves or how they should work together. So it is a confusing and convoluted process. So are there any clarification questions about the first part of Etienne's presentation when she outlined the process? Wow, you did a good job. Everyone got it. Okay, yes, please. Wait for a microphone because we are recording and this is being webcast. Allow us to give your name and your affiliation. And turn the mic the next side. Yep. You're right, there you go, perfect.
Good afternoon. My name is Govinda Rai, Deputy Conservator of Forest, Bangladesh Forest Department. One observation, that is, you have indicated that there should have universal access to sexual and reproductive health. So my question on climate refugee, because climate refugee is not responsible for their activities, they are fall to the activities which that is the country which is responsible for emitting. For the remission, they are responsible for their load. But in case of climate refugee, they should have universal access to any place. They should have access to any place if you consider it.
Okay, great, thank you. So I think it's not exactly a clarification question on the process, but perhaps we could come to that point in the discussion looking at climate refugees and their access to services and ensuring that they have access to universal access to services. Okay, so yes, is it on the process and sort of the, so we'll get to the more substantive questions afterwards, but clarification on the process.
I'm Saeed Mahmoud Riyad. I'm working for IUCN, Bangladesh Country Office. I would like to know or more clarification about the universally applicable to all countries regarding the Sustainable Development Goal. Is it possible to universally applicable to all countries?
So this
Regarding
is,
the sustainable goal, you mentioned it.
go ahead, it's on.
Oh, okay.
Lofty and ambitious. Is
Because
it
the
possible?
background, the scenario is different.
Thank you. So can we, is that possible? Is this pie in the sky?
Yeah.
Is this too aspirational?
I think there's a understanding that not necessarily all of the targets may apply to all of the countries, that some countries will have already met the target for particular pieces, but that there's the way the goals are constructed, that there will be room for growth, particularly at the indicator level for each of the countries. At the, well, yeah, do you want to speak to that? Yeah.
So just one quick thing to add. So I think that's exactly right. I think that you'll see in the open working group targets that already exist, and obviously those may change, but that there are different kinds of targets. And so some targets are sort of global aggregates, like the MDGs were, and so that's things like end extreme poverty. So you're talking about end extreme poverty everywhere, and the way that you measure that is what extreme poverty looks like globally. We have now a complementary target that's about national poverty lines that should apply, that should be determined nationally, and so the goal itself, the target itself should be determined nationally, and therefore the measurement, it will also be national. What's that? Well, no, so the idea is that there are both. So that you have global universal targets, so things like ending extreme poverty, but then you also have targets that will apply to others. So we, in the United States, would already be beyond the extreme poverty line, and the poverty that we have is above 125 a day. So for that, we would ourselves have to set a target based on our own poverty line, and we would sort of then be kind of also on the hook. That's what the universal agenda means, is that we are on the hook as much as any other country is on the hook, as any developing country.
Right, good. Thank you very much. And then, Etiana, very much appreciated your points about integration and your point about having stories from countries like Malawi, like Madagascar, like the Philippines, really knowing that there's some evidence to support this idea of integration, and then sort of recognizing the importance of resilience and poverty alleviation. So thank you very much. Let's move on to our second speaker. So Ilse is coming from the UN Foundation and is the Senior Director of Global Partnerships. And Ilse and I met a few months ago in Ethiopia at the International Family Planning Conference, and Ilse was hearing our conversations about integration, and she got very excited and said, wow, this is the best thing in family planning that I've heard in years. So we're very much looking forward to hearing you building off of that and talking a little bit about how you engage some new partners in this effort. So.
Thank you, Roger Mark. Now, you've exposed the fact that it also reflects that I had been away from the field of family planning for about 5 years, and so I was maybe a little bit out of date, but there is a reason why I was so incredibly excited to hear about all the great work being done on population health and the environment, which is linking reproductive health and population and climate and sustainability issues. So yes, as Roger Mark said, I want to talk to you about, I'll drill down a little bit more on reproductive health and family planning than my colleagues, so you'll see sort of a balanced presentation. And yes, as he alluded to, I want to talk a little bit about a slightly new angle and a new set of opportunities that we have around this topic. I also want to acknowledge I have 2 UN Foundation colleagues in the room, Melinda Kimball and Catherine, who's Ms. Zizik, I think. She just joined. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. It's almost as gnarly as mine. But in any case, I welcome you to also help answer questions, particularly about the post-2015 agenda setting, which UN Foundation is very, very much involved in. And it is very, very exciting because of its universality And the complexity is really a reflection of how inclusive the process is this year. It's even inclusive of the private sector, which is an area that I work on specifically. So that's a hint on what I want to talk to you about today. So one quick point before we dive in, I love the title of this session because it's so catchy and not dry like so many other sessions that we hear about. But these issues actually were covered quite extensively. So family planning and reproductive health, sexual and reproductive health and rights were covered in quite a few sessions. And as was climate, obviously we had a climate summit that took place last week. But I think the big point that's being brought to bear today is that no one is discussing, not no one, but it's a very special group, would be my personal assessment of where we are now. So it's a very special group that's talking about these issues in an integrated fashion. And I personally do not understand why that is. So I'm excited to be here to talk to you about this today and really look forward to people's comments and ideas about how to move past this, if you agree. So why don't I jump right into the ROI? So basically, an insight that we had, and let me just give you one more point of context. There are no companies that are involved in promoting family planning around the world other than companies that manufacture contraceptives. There are a couple of really tiny exceptions to that rule, but basically certainly no multinationals. No one, the way Coca-Cola has gotten behind women's economic empowerment and Walmart has done the same, or the myriad of companies who are supporting education, access to water, access to sanitation. Unilever's going so big on this incredibly huge topic. Peace and security, access to education, legal rights. Every issue under the sun almost is addressed by corporations. But for some reason, family planning has never been covered or championed by a single corporation other than the three major corporations and the few smaller companies around the world that actually manufacture contraceptives. So that's interesting. So we think that contraception is an incredibly smart investment for global development. The first argument that we lead with is around the economic argument, and in fact we have quite a few colleagues from Bangladesh here today, and I'm pleased that the example that we have in print is also citing research in Bangladesh, which, as many of you know, Bangladesh is a real success story in reproductive health and maternal health. They have reduced their total fertility rate from somewhere between 5 and 7 to just over 2. It's the envy of many other neighboring countries. So as a ripple effect of that, and this was examined in a specific study, families that were practicing family planning over time had 43% more access to economic resources. I think many people are familiar with the demographic dividend argument, and which really underpins the growth in countries like Indonesia, which also is a major success story in terms of granting women and couples the ability to plan their families. In sub-Saharan Africa, the estimates are quite staggering that GDP would increase by 25 to 30% if unmet need for family planning were met for couples and for women. And then there's for those who are champions of education, we also think that they might be interested in the issue of family planning, because if we were able to prevent unwanted pregnancy among adolescent girls, an estimated 7.4 million more girls would be able to attend school more fully the way that boys are able to and their colleagues are able to. On the environmental front, there is an incredible amount of data linking the ability to both for families to plan their families as well as women's empowerment that would help support, mostly through less of a burden in terms of population, on the environment. As Etiana was just alluding to, it also goes the other way, so there's a very strong linkage in terms of environmental dangers that the world is facing and the particular burden that women face. But right now, what I'm highlighting is, for anyone interested, there really is a lot of data that is quite compelling around the impact that meeting unmet need for family planning would have on stabilizing population and the ripple effects that would accrue there in terms of water access, reducing carbon emissions, and so on and so forth. There's also really interesting data on political stability. That is something that we imagine would be of interest to everybody on the planet: peace and security and safety. And basically, again, a lot of research available for anyone who's interested, but there's a very tight correlation between countries with rapidly growing populations, with pretty severe limits on women's rights, including their reproductive rights, and growing youth populations without the means of providing for the needs of those young people, and economic instability. So if people aren't sold by those arguments, we also think that people who are deeply concerned about global development would also find the impact of meeting unmet need for family planning on the MDGs and on global development quite compelling. So in the realm of maternal and children's health, if we met the unmet need for family planning, we would have 1.1 million fewer infants dying every year. We would have a third fewer maternal deaths. So think about it. If we did nothing else, all the investments being made in maternal health, if we just met the family planning needs, we would have a third fewer cases of maternal mortality, not to even mention morbidity, which is the illness and disability that results in women who don't die but who are injured during childbirth. And then huge impact in terms of prevention of maternal to child transmission of HIV. So you'd have 1/3 fewer, 3 times fewer babies born, and the cost of preventing maternal to child transmission or parental to child transmission of HIV is half if we address family planning. And then there's arguments which some of you might be familiar with, but basically for every dollar invested in family planning, the returns to a whole government in terms of costs around education, water, sanitation, immunizations, malaria control, and things like that range between $2 and $9. It's a very, very, very high ROI investment. So basically, the point that we wanted to make is that this remains a niche issue. I would say that when Etiana was talking about some issues that were thorny during the SDGs discussions as being old and not new issues, I would definitely say that family planning and sexual and reproductive health and rights is one of those. It's been a battleground since, throughout history, and we think that by tying the importance of this issue with issues that so many other people care about, it will take more of a front and center position in global development, and we hope even in corporate investment, which I'll get to in a moment. So I also just want to point out an incredibly interesting study. I have not had time to follow up on it, but about 3 weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal published an article that reported the results of a study that was done by 60 economists. They analyzed all 179 targets of the SDGs and ranked them in terms of the return on investment and which ones we should be focusing on. And family planning and reproductive health in particular was cited as in the top 5 with an incredibly high return on investment. So very eager to look that up and I was very pleased to see that up there. So why companies? Why are we focusing on companies? Part of the reason is because as I was pointing out, companies have not been involved in this issue so far, and there are a lot of us in global development who feel very strongly that the role of the corporate sector is incredibly important to global development and to the quality of life of everybody on this planet, the constructive involvement of the private sector. And we at the UN Foundation are working on that. We also mobilize a lot of partnerships in support of other goals that we work on in the realm of global health and energy and climate change, and also women, girls, and population. So there are 2 reasons why we think companies should be brought to the table on this issue. One is the impact that they can have. We are in the process of calculating right now the number of people who are employed through formal employment around the world, but it is massive. And so if you think about the number of employees that are within the reach, so the number of women and men who are within the reach of companies around the world, it's quite staggering. And a lot of companies provide healthcare services for their employees, so they could have a tremendous impact. If you add to that the reach that they have through their community programs, the number gets much, much bigger. And then the third thing is that companies, one of the exciting new frontiers around partnerships is not just asking companies to donate money and to contribute to donor funding. Obviously, as most of you know, partnerships are so much more dynamic in this day and age, and there's increasing recognition that companies can have a lot that they can bring to bear, particularly their core competencies, their know-how, their employees' skill base and knowledge base. So there's a lot that can be done in the realm of supply chain and marketing, reaching young people. Young people, probably know, but we have the largest youth cohort on the planet right now. We have more people turning 16 than ever before on the planet. So if you think about it, they are all entering reproductive age. And so again, our hypothesis is that this is going to be important to corporate executives as well when we make them aware of it. So the other hypothesis is that if we get companies involved and we get executives to speak out and that we get them to put their brand names behind it, that the issue will not be so controversial as it has been to date. It's a big hypothesis. We don't know, but it stands to reason that would be the case, that there would be a certain protective factor. And we take this issue sort of out of the closet and out of the realm of just a women's rights issue, but really where it belongs front and center, because really it's front and center in everybody's life in one way or another, man or woman. So just to wrap up, what are we doing? We being the UN Foundation. So the UN Foundation is an NGO that's affiliated with the UN. We exist to support the UN. That's our core role, but we also have programs in global health and in energy and climate change and in women, girls, and population. So we are leveraging our relationships with organizations like the Wilson Center and PAI and the host of NGOs who've been doing really wonderful work in this space, and we want to amplify it. There are really great reports that have been written, even by UNFPA, the UN agency that works on maternal and reproductive health. And I had the pleasure of reading these, which have been sitting in my office for months, and I haven't read them, and I read them on the train down this morning, thinking they're incredible. But they're speaking to all of us. I'm guessing that every single one of us in the room works either for government or for NGOs. So we think that there's an opportunity to really make an impact by reaching new audiences, and not only in every country of the world, and we're inviting companies all over the world to take part in this. This is not just the Coca-Colas and Unilevers of the world. So again, collaborating with UNFPA and with UN Women, which just launched the He for She campaign, which of course is a wonderful platform to talk about these issues. We are the Secretariat for the FP 2020 initiative, which is the initiative that resulted from Melinda Gates's groundbreaking speech and meeting that she convened in London in 2012 that really helped put family planning back on the map. We also help mobilize private sector partnerships for every woman, every child. So these are we think, important global platforms that we can leverage to help make a difference on this topic. We need to get more data. We need to get more tools and communications resources that we can all use. But I just want to end by saying that if you also agree that this is an important issue and it's something that you know something about, or you have reach into these audiences, we invite you to take part and to keep track on what it is that we're doing, because we would really like to invite all of the voices and stakeholders to join. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very shout out and thank you to the UN Foundation for supporting this work and building these partnerships. I was quite struck by your comment at the very beginning. No companies are involved in promoting family planning except the three major ones that manufacture contraceptives, and sort of building on that to look at the benefits of contraception and what that means to overall looking at progress towards the MDGs. As you talked about the role of the private sector, I think you talked about 4 areas. You know, the impact that they can have in terms of their reach, the reach through community programs, partnerships using their core competencies and building off of that, and then their brand name and weight to make this an issue that's no longer just a women's rights issue. And I had a question on that, actually. I was quite intrigued as you talk about the role of the private sector. You know, if you are going to go in to a company and make the case, you have to make a case on a return on investment for them. And I didn't quite hear you make that case. What is the corporate case for family planning, contraception, reproductive health? Is that something that you're working on? Could you help us think a little bit more about that?
Yes, that's an excellent question, and the reason why I didn't talk about it is because, to our knowledge, it doesn't really exist yet, and it's one of the things that we need to produce. So that's front and center, one of the first things that we're working on. Just 2 quick points on that. Number one, I actually want to correct that statement. There are no companies working on this in Indonesia through a project called Project Hope, which Merck for Mothers is supporting, and along with other donors. And there's a project in Bangladesh that UNFPA is working on as well that is engaging companies' workforces in just through their healthcare. So they've agreed to provide family planning through their employee healthcare programs. So we're starting to see a little bit of progress. But we did just convene meetings in 3 countries with companies and roundtables to discuss this issue, and they do want to know the ROI. They get the bigger picture, but even if you get an individual executive passionate about this issue, she or he has to go to and justify it. And so the task that is upon us is to unpack that information and to where needed to get that research. And unfortunately, it doesn't really exist at the moment. So we're going to inch our way there. But to start building the business case, right now we have kind of the macro case that we hope will compel some companies to take a step forward. Clearly, anybody who cares about youth, which is a lot of companies these days, a lot of companies that market to young people, we hope. But again, we're going out on a bit of a limb, and we're going to get started despite not having perfect information. So you're right, Roger, that's a priority.
Great, thank you very much. So let's move on to our next speaker. Genevieve is a policy advisor to the U.S. Ambassador, the U.S. Mission to the UN, and I think you're going to talk a little bit more about the peace and stability side of these connections. So Genevieve?
All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much. It is really exciting to be part of this conversation. I really do like the title of the session, and I'm going to try and go back to it a few times because I think this is actually a hugely important question to ask. I think everything was on the table last week, every issue. So figuring out sort of a way to work through that to something that's sort of meaningful, I think is kind of our task, probably more than it is finding the things that weren't on the table, but I'll get to that. So I think this was sort of great to come after because I often, as a U.S. government person, end up giving the how does the process work kind of stuff. So it's fun to get to talk about a bit of the substance. So I think that first, sort of starting off with the post-2015 conversation, I really do think we have an absolutely extraordinary opportunity right now to do a few things. One, to build on sort of a moment of global attention, thanks to the successes of the MDGs, thanks to sort of the way that the MDGs sort of rose up and were, certainly some achieved, but I think more just kind of caught global attention for development and created the idea of having a global agenda. So even though they might not have started out that way, and that wasn't their intention originally, that's where they ended up. And I think as a result, we're in a really good moment to sort of build on that momentum, both of the positives and of sort of the frustrations that the MDGs sort of unearthed. Certainly a lot of lacking issues. So I think we really do sit at a good moment to be able to ask these questions. I think it enables us to really ask what compels transformative change. And to get a moment in time to stop and really ask that kind of question globally is a pretty phenomenal opportunity. It does mean that there are a lot of conflicting answers to that question, but it's ours to sort of, our task to sort that out. And I think, you know, the way that we do that, the way that we sort that out is to, as much as possible, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but is to try and get to what are the drivers of progress and sort of what are the root causes of the problems that we collectively believe to be problems. I think we have a lot of these answers already because we've been doing this kind of work for quite a long time. But I think we have to remind ourselves over and over and over again that our task is to try and kind of have some sort of rubric for determining what really are sort of the drivers of progress and the causes of, and the converse, the causes of problems. So with that as sort of the starting point, I think you very rightly labeled the 4 issues that we were up until, I was going to say 4 o'clock in the morning, but that's not true, until 2 o'clock in the afternoon the next day, sort of struggling with. These are the most sort of politically contentious and tricky issues, and they will be until the end, I'm certain. So the one that I'll specifically talk about right now is peace and governance, but obviously each of these is worthy of the same kind of attention. And these really, I think one of the reasons is not just because they're politically tricky, but also because these are some of the more transformative change kind of that are going to be a bit more difficult to put into, to sort of get in all of our minds. So on the peace side of things, so I think a lot of these statistics and this sort of data that the empirics that are part of this have been in the collective, I don't know, consciousness, I think, for probably some time, but certainly starting in with the World Development Report in 2011. So the World Development Report in 2011 focused on peace and its impact on development, and many of these slides are from that. So when we look at extreme poverty, which will remain at the center of this agenda, so it's excellent that it is growing and that we're sort of understanding a bit more all of the different pieces that make up what one does to try and eradicate poverty. But that is very much going to be at the center. And if we look at where poverty is sitting now, we see that it's going to be sort of moving more and more to these tricky pockets that are hard to deal with, and that is often in conflict-affected countries. So by next year, over 50% of the world's poorest will live in conflict-affected countries. By 2030, so the end of the post-2015 agenda time period, 80% are projected to live in conflict-affected countries. So this is largely this is because as economic growth lifts people out of poverty, the places where it will remain are the ones where the easy economic growth pathways don't touch, and that tends to be regions that are fragile or conflict affected. So, and as you can see, the blue is Asia, and the red are Africa. So you can see that sort of it's moving more in a direction. This is 2012. This is 2030. So this is to say we know a lot of the statistics. We know that that these things are deeply related, that it is very, very difficult to talk about development progress without talking about peace, without talking about the way that you deal with providing basic human services in places that are conflict affected. This is not going to be an easy conversation. People have been working on this for a long time and don't have easy answers, but they have been working on this for a long time and have answers. So it makes sense to sort of put our minds collectively, globally, on this issue. This is just another to say that countries with major violence had a 21-point higher poverty rate from 1981 to 2005. There are a few others I'm just going to run through very quickly. The average cost of civil conflict is equivalent to 30 years of GDP growth. So those two, that previous slide, go hand in hand with this. I put the next one here. The UNESCO estimates 28+ million children are not in school in countries that are emerging from conflict. So if we are going to set another, speaking of integration, if we're going to set a goal that says we're going to get to universal primary education, we will not get there if we don't deal with issues of conflict and of peace. So that's one. Similarly, child mortality is twice as high. Undernutrition is 3 times as likely in countries affected by severe violence. And speaking to the earlier question about universality, we often bring these statistics out for the areas where the extreme poor are concentrated. But this is as much true in the United States as it is anywhere. We were on a team in the open working group with Canada and Israel. And at some point in the middle of this, when we were talking about peace and governance, we looked up the statistics about where we, the United States, ranked in relation to our teammates, as well as in relation to everybody else in the room on homicide rates. We're not in a great place. we are significantly worse than Canada and Israel on that. And I mean, this is not new knowledge, but it is something that we're going to have to wrestle with, because when you look at communities that are facing severe violence in the United States, those are the communities with the worst human development indicators. So this is a universal thing, and to the extent that we are going to sort of put things about violent deaths, things about justice systems on the table, all you have to do is open a newspaper to realize that we also are dealing with these kinds of issues. So, so this is these two. Oh, that's the end of the presentation, but not the end of my talking. So the one I kind of want to, with the peace and governance stuff on the table, want to move very quickly to the question of focus. So the idea of we had conversations throughout the week last, obviously there was the climate summit, there were a number of climate events, there were a number of very excellent sort of questions about how you measure peace and governance on the table last week. There were some very good population sessions. So we have been talking about all of these things, sort of somewhat ad nauseum, but in a good way. The question is within that, and there are so many, I mean, as I sort of have said, there are so many really good arguments for why thousands of issues need to be part of this agenda. That's one reason we ended up with 169 targets and 17 goals. It's because this isn't an easy question. It's not like we weren't working very hard for a year and a half to get this focused. But every time we would talk about taking one thing off the table, a significant constituency, both within member states and in the NGO community, would come up and say, don't take that off the table. That's absolutely critical to what we're doing here. So we need to sort of collectively figure out what our criteria are for focus. And I think if I had to pick one thing, the one big idea that wasn't on the table last week, it was focus. It was figuring out how to prioritize among the many, many things, all of which are important. Our goal isn't to figure out which aren't important. Our goal is to figure out either how to integrate or sort of consolidate ideas to bring them together and kind of collectively get to action so that we get fewer ideas so our minds can actually conceive of how to do this. Or it's to figure out what we're most effective at. And so I think the kind of criteria were certainly put forward in Rio Plus 20. We had limited in number, universally relevant, action-oriented, easy to communicate, as Etiana put on the board earlier. But then we also have to sort of ask ourselves, what is achievable? What is achievable and aspirational? What is measurable? And some of the things don't necessarily need to be as we set out, but we have to have a game plan to figure out how to measure them by the end. And then also sort of, if we do a thorough analysis of the sort of evidence base of it, what do we end up with as the answers for what we can actually affect change on? So there are a number of things that are critical issues. If you look at the open working group's output, and it's really great evening reading, there are some really focused, excellent indicators, and then there are a number that you couldn't, if you thought about how to implement them, if you thought about how to actually do something with them, you would have nothing, because you take something that started out in the MDGs is extremely effective, the HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria goal. In this round, we kept that and sort of end the epidemics of, and had a pretty good and robust discussion about that. But then in the end, in the 11th and the 11.5th hour, it added and other communicable diseases. So now we are left with a target that literally takes on every disease that the world faces. We, as a community, both civil society and government and private sector, know how to do better than that. And we have to hold ourselves to be more precise than that, to be more rigorous in how we set our own priorities. And that probably means saying to ourselves, this is an issue that matters deeply to me and deeply to my organization, and it isn't something that we can actually do in this period of time. Or it's something that shouldn't be on governments to do. We should highlight that as something that should be on X number of other organizations to do. We have to ask those questions about who are the right actors, and how do we determine an agenda that's based on that, and how do we know that not putting something in this agenda doesn't mean we don't care about it. We have to be able to sort of know that we can have another system, or a system that's complementary to this, to flag critical issues without without needing to have them be part of this. So this is on us as well. I mean, we're having this struggle internally nonstop. We have had it for the last year and a half, and we'll keep having it, and that's our responsibility too. But it's sort of all of our responsibilities to sort of as a globe to kind of get to a point where we can make hard decisions. So that's that. I've probably gone, I don't even know what time it is. I've gone on a bit long. But one other thing I want to sort of raise that I think actually was, I have tons of time. So one other thing I wanted to raise that I thought was on the table last week that that both was and wasn't on the table last week that I actually think is probably the crux of all of this, or at least pretty close to it, is the concept of multilateralism. So if you watch the president's speech, on he had the climate speech and then also his regular General Assembly speech. Watch them both, but the General Assembly one is the one I'm referring to. So he did something very, I think, in all of it. He was talking a lot about foreign terrorist fighters, about ISIL, about all sorts of issues that thankfully are tricky enough that we don't have to deal with them in this agenda. But he talked about climate, he talked about the development agenda, and in each of them, what the speech marked was a turn to multilateralism, was a turn to a recognition that you can't achieve any of these complex things without it being about cooperation. And I think some of that is very obvious, but I think it's also sort of fundamental to the success of this, because it is about bringing in the private sector. It is about bringing in civil society and saying there's a role for all of us in this pathway towards this goal, and we have to define what those roles are, and we have to be okay working out the really tricky parts of multilateralism in order to get there. And I think the last thing I'll say is just that in addition to just saying, yeah, multilateralism is great, I mean, that's sort of a part of this whole orientation of talking about post-2015 here, it's also our ability to get to success on this is going to test multilateralism. I think this was the UN's kind of big ticket item of success for a while. I mean, outside of the Security Council, on the development agenda, the MDGs were one of the big ticket UN items. If we can't do this well in the next year and a half and then the 15 years that follow, we will be potentially, I mean, sounds sort of alarmist, we will potentially be calling into question what the UN is all about and what multilateralism is all about in the first place. So we sort of all are compelled to to ask these tough questions and then to figure out a way, if our answer is different than somebody else's, to work that out. Because if we don't, it really does, I think, call into question a lot of what we're even here for. So.
Thank you very much, Genevieve. So I like that you started about this moment of global attention for development and talking about the importance of transformative change, but then saying that we're really stuck on these tricky issues, and the fact that they are tricky is because they are transformative. So that really comes together. I also like your statement that, folks have been working on this for a long time and they don't have easy answers, but there are answers. We do have a sense of how we can move forward. There's some sense of direction. I also very much appreciated when you talked about peace and stability and brought it home for us in the United States and really took it down to a sub-national level. I think that was a very important reminder, and I think that really makes it real. Of course, you made me chuckle. The one thing that wasn't there was focus. So everything else was there, and really posing these tough questions. If you're in these negotiations and you have everyone advocating, lobbying, everything is important, how do you come up with criteria about what can we do well, what can we do best, what is most effective, and not having something on the agenda doesn't mean that there's no action on it. Who should be taking that action? And then taking us back to multilateralism and sort of the importance back to President Obama. So having listened to you and having imagined this process that you just went through, which sounds as if it was both exhilarating and exhausting at the same time, what are you most hopeful about coming through that process? Because it sounds really tough. So what are you most excited about? Where are you seeing the greatest potential that we as a community of people who are interested and think that this is really important, where should we be looking to for hope?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I'm sure if you asked me it in 10 minutes, I might answer it differently. But because I think I really do actually think there were quite a few sources of hope in our dance that we did up in New York. I think that probably the best of all was that, I think coming out of Rio +20 and moving into this Sustainable Development Goal conversation, there was quite a bit of skepticism about what role that would play, certainly in post-2015, about whether this whole effort was going to kind of just fall apart and fail. Not the post-2015 effort, but certainly the Sustainable Development Goal effort to bring together environment and the more poverty reduction development focus. I think what you found instead was that way more than the 70 countries on the Open Working Group engaged this and engaged it in a sustained way, and engaged in a year non-negotiation, a year of analytical, rigorous, in the technical weeds conversation about what actually affects change. And so while there were politics at the end, of course there were politics at the end, it's the UN. So I think that probably the most hopeful thing was that the whole base, the whole foundation on which we were having the political discussions came from a very technically rigorous and not only technically rigorous, but one in which all of the countries that were at the table bought in. And that wasn't a foregone conclusion at the outset of this. So I think the fact that we are still in that conversation and we have a year left, but we're starting from a point where we are all kind of, we know each other, we know the arguments, we've surfaced what the issues are, we can kind of go further because we've already gotten here. I'm glad that this isn't September of 2015, because if it was September of 2015, we would not get as far in the end. But we have a year left to get even further, and to me, that's very hopeful.
Okay, great. So that perspective, once again, on the process, which is another way to look at this complicated process. Thank you. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Wael, who's the Director of Climate Action Network International. And those of you who don't know CAN, it's a fantastic network for those of us who work on and care about climate change and realistically what we can do. So Wael, I'd like to give it over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to speak here. I just came from New York and going back, so I just came here specifically for this presentation, which I value a lot. And I'm going to tackle the very simple issue of climate change within the post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda. I will start with an overall reflection and a bit of a reflection on what has been said so far. This being the last speaker, this is the only reconciliation that I can have. First, on overall, when we started working on climate change in the post-2015, and we started from the beginning, we started from the Rio +20 process and moved on as CAN community to New York to continue the work to achieve the new Sustainable Development Goals. When we started, there was really no interest on climate change. This is the first thing that we've realized. We felt that there is a deep lack in understanding of the climate change issue and its implication on poverty and development in general. This is when we started. And there were almost no interest on having a climate goal among countries. Slowly, we continued working on it, and interest has increased. The first countries that showed great interest in having a climate goal was actually Bangladesh, so it's good to see some representatives from Bangladesh here, and others started to join. And every time a new draft of the Open Working Group was coming out, the UN staff supporting the co-chairs would assure us that climate change will not make it to the next draft. 100% sure. We kept challenging that, and eventually we have now a climate goal. In the Open Working Group report, having a climate goal, although doesn't solve the issue that the understanding or the awareness among communities on the importance of climate change. And I say communities, it's not only on government level, but it has to happen on all levels to really tackle this issue. And the march on last Sunday, one key call of action was that to change everything, we need everyone. And actually, this is the nature of climate change. It really intersects with everything we do, and it is the existential issue on the table that can affect the survival of human civilization. And it gets surprising when you go into outside of the climate bubble, which is the UNFCCC and such fora, you come to another forum, this understanding of climate change doesn't exist. The importance of having climate change be moved from an environmental problem to become a developmental and even existential issue has to be understood by governments and communities around the world. This is the only way to solve it. So now we have it as a goal, and there is a danger that if the number of goals are reopened, that climate change goal might be dropped. Also having the number of the goal 13, the unlucky number, doesn't help much. I hope this doesn't affect anything, but we cannot imagine a sustainable development agenda in this time and age that doesn't include a climate goal. We really cannot, the credibility of the whole system will be in danger. So we want successful agenda, not only for climate change, we want a successful integrated agenda, and having a climate goal is essential for that. And what is annoying is that the main reason the climate goal is in question because there is another process that will end after 7 weeks, which is a negotiation process for a new agreement under UNFCCC. And this is the only reason. So just for 7 weeks difference, we want to remove climate change from a development agenda for the next 15 years. So it doesn't make sense at all, and that's why we think we need to continue on it. Now, I really stuck to the 3 areas missing there. And on climate change, there are 3 levels of improvement that can happen on climate change. There is improvement that can happen on the goal level, on the target level, and also on the preamble level. So there are the goals and targets discussed, but also there will be a preamble coming out of the agreement, which we think also is important and needs to be considered carefully. Now, we consider 2 goals to be climate goal, actually. There's the climate goal, of course, but the energy goal, we look at it as 50% climate change. So there is the access for all, affordable energy for everyone, and also having it sustainable. It doesn't contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. On the goal level, we really think that the strength of the goals is how inspirational and aspirational they are, okay? We don't, because it's not legally binding, the agenda, it has to move feelings. It has to make people on all levels. The MDGs were successful partly because it wasn't only a government agenda. A lot of institutions from private sector as well as of civil society used the goals as a guidance for any kind of community work they wanted to do. And the more inspirational the language of the goals are, the more empowered they will be. So currently, if you look at most of the goals, they are very technical. They're very in a language that is diplomatically crafted. And I think we don't have to be in this setting, in this forum, to be that critical about the language and how much it binds us. Because in their nature, they're not legally binding. So we would like to have this goal reflect, the climate goal reflect some of the spirit that was captured actually in the climate summit last week. Many countries talked about decarbonizing their economy. Many countries talked about 100% renewable energy, reaching greenhouse gas neutrality. Ethiopia said they're going to be greenhouse gas neutral by 2025, a very inspirational goal and ambitious, very ambitious. So for us, this we cannot achieve in the UNFCCC because UNFCCC is legally binding in nature. We cannot have this kind of inspiration. That's why one of the things as CAN would like to work on in the coming year is to make the language stronger, such as for the climate change, we would like to have a goal that says achieve 0 net greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. We cannot attach a number to when that would be, so in a political reality, but I think we can have this kind of spirit in the goal. We think that the goals don't have to be attached to the 2030 year. The targets, we think they have to be in that time frame. We think that the goals should be universal, not only in space, but through time as well. So they can be continued to work on in the new agenda after 2030. The same thing for the energy goal. We can also be inspirational, and what is working on is the 100% renewable energy target, which we can put it in the goal as well. On a target levels, there are two issues with targets. There are the targets under the climate goals and the energy goals, but also in climate change, we need to look at the cross-section across goals. Climate change is involved in everything, and we worked in a civil society process with the UN, and we produced a report called Breaking Down the Silos. It was the title of the report. And we want to look at the new goals differently than the MDGs, is that we cannot look at each goal separately. We need to look how each of the goals interact with each other, and how to translate it into the outcome eventually is how the targets can interact with each other. And actually, if you look at the different targets under the different goals, you see linkages between the different goals. And even issues that are not, do not have a goal, they have been captured with targets. So going to the climate and energy targets, the most important thing for the climate goal is not to interfere with the UNFCCC process. This is, we agree with the parties that it is important. We don't see value of discussing the same thing in two places. But this does not mean we should not have a climate goal. We just need to have targets that are not discussed under the UNFCCC process. And there's a lot of things that are not discussed there. For example, the development of decarbonization plans for developed countries, and also for developing countries, low carbon development plans, so how they can increase, achieve the development they aspire to without having to increase their greenhouse gas emissions. National legislation, the national arrangement on how the countries can put structures to work on climate change, these are not part of the UNFCCC process. So in a non-legally binding process like the post-2015 process, we can include that there. And the same thing applies for the energy goal targets. There are some changes we can have, such as having more stronger numbers for renewable energy and energy efficiency. Climate proofing, we see that climate change already exists under several goals, such as the cities, consumption and production, food, and poverty. They are very clearly linked to climate change. There are others that should be linked. Growth, so decoupling of greenhouse gases from the growth pathway. Education, at the moment, doesn't include climate change. This is another improvement we can do. And water. So food and water, they're the same thing. Both are impacted by climate change a lot. In the food goal, we include climate change, and we're needing to address the impacts of climate change on food. We need to do the same thing on water. And actually, I forgot to add peace and conflict, which we have seen a lot of reports linking the Syrian situation to climate change, as well as the Horn of Africa. And this will only increase in the future. Actually, many analysts say that the existential threat of climate change is not the direct impact of climate change on humanity, but leading us to a nuclear war or something really bad by competing on the dwindling resources and the lack of food and water caused by climate change. On the preamble, there's a whole paragraph in the existing preamble of the Open Working Group report, although this preamble doesn't mean it's going to be the preamble for the agreed outcome next year, but it's important to look what is in there, because it could be copied to the preamble. We see it very general and misses a lot of key parts. For example, it does recognize the relationship, it doesn't recognize the relation between climate change and the other goals. And here we can use what was mentioned in the high-level panel report, high-level panel of eminent persons report, which talks about climate change in a way that recognizes that not addressing climate change will prevent us from achieving any other goal. And this is very important to realize if we want to remove climate change from an environmental issue into a development and existential issue. That if we don't address climate change, it is science that all other goals cannot be achieved. And it has to be reflected or copied into the preamble. Another thing, its relationship with the UNFCCC process. The existing language in relation to the UNFCCC only warns from the impact of the post-2015 on the UNFCCC process. So it talks about the countries, the sentence that exists there says, everyone is aware that UNFCCC is where the legally binding negotiations happen. Actually, we need to add to it the positive part of the interaction, which is that a failure of any of these processes will mean a failure of the other. So there should be linked together to say that the Paris meeting happening after 7 weeks is instrumental for the success of the post-2015 process, and somehow it needs to be captured in the preamble. A final thing I want to say, in less than a minute, is that this idea of needing to have, I always wonder why the need to have manageable number of goals. I don't think there's any scientific or analytical reason for that. It's more personal, psychological reason that the number is important. All of these issues, 17 issues, and it's great they reached 17 issues out of the numbers that they started from, are very important. And we will be working on them between now and 2030. On a universal level, the need to make the number small, and I know some countries don't want to open the numbers, they want to keep the 17 goals, which to some extent I'm relieved because I think they are important, and there is no concrete reason why we want to reduce them. I don't know, maybe because the number that I've heard is 10, it's a manageable number, and the 10, I don't know, is it because we have the 10 fingers on our hands, or the 10 commandments that Moses brought? I mean, if he brought 17 goals, would 17 would be okay, or if he had 17 fingers, would it become okay? I don't understand why do we need to reduce them. It's good to be able to say the 17 goals, memorize them, but even 10, I'm not sure, even the 8, I don't know the 8 Millennium Development Goals of 2000. So should we take them to 3 to memorize them? Then everyone will start having cardiac arrests. I think we really need to consider what we will lose if we reopen the goals. And from my understanding, the most important issues are the most sensitive issues, the most politically tough issues. And if we want to reopen, we're going to lose the things that are different from the previous agenda. And we're going to go to the easiest, lowest common denominator, which we should avoid. I know every country puts in its priority tackling poverty, right? The goal will be there because no one's going to say, no, I'm against tackling poverty in my country. This is the reason why everyone puts economy ahead of anything else. But issues like climate change, conflict, governance, these issues are the tricky ones, and we will lose them if we open the number of goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wael. So it was good to see how CAN, as such a major actor in the climate space, is looking at this process, and sort of a reminder of the importance of engaging communities, looking at the goal, the target, the preamble, figuring out where you fit in, a reminder about inspirational, in addition to aspirational language, the importance of breaking down the silos and thinking about the number of goals and making sure that we don't have a cardiac arrest as a result. So my quick question for you is, I was quite struck by your statement that you got into this process and you recognized that those of us who are involved in the UNFCCC process were in a bubble. And you sort of, wow, we stepped out of this bubble and discovered that those who are not part of our UNFCCC work don't fully get climate. How do you address that? That's a really heavy lift. That's really difficult. What's your strategy around dealing with that as a global network?
For us, we started on civil society level. I think this is the easiest low-hanging fruit that you can approach the different civil society actors, the development movement. So we're talking to GCAP, the Global Campaign Against Poverty, Civicus, huge civil society networks, and other similar networks engaged in the post-2015 or the development world, and trying to engage in common narratives for them to understand climate change. And we achieved a lot. There's a huge campaign planned for next year by civil society called Action 2015, which addresses the two processes. UN Foundation is part of it, but it's for the post-2015 process as well as the UNFCCC process. And also working with governments and engaging with in these negotiations specifically, addressing climate change in these negotiations helps many missions in New York who are not usually the UNFCCC. Some of them are UNFCCC negotiators, but the wider diplomatic teams are starting to understand climate change more. And we see actually in the climate summit speeches of heads of states, most of them, their speeches on climate change include that climate change is critical for development and economical growth, and it's actually in our economic interest to tackle climate change. And these we didn't hear before. So the situation is changing, and hopefully to the better. If you look at the MDGs in 2000 and now the draft in OWG, you can see that sustainability is way different than it was before. So the 15 years difference are very visible in the OWG reports, and hopefully we continue on that path.
Great, thank you. This has been fascinating. Let's open it up. When we take multiple questions at a time, my colleagues will come around with a microphone. Please give your name and your affiliation. And once again, this is being webcast, so please.
Hi, I'm Lisa Palmer. I'm a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. I'm with the Roger Marks program. I had a question. I think it was Genevieve who mentioned this, that I didn't get the number. You said that conflict affects GDP growth for a certain number of years. And I wanted to see if you could repeat that figure, as well as why isn't that statement your argument for having corporate folks address the contraception issue?
Great, thank you. Yes, we have this gentleman up here, and then you, please.
I'm Jed Schilling, Senior Advisor at the Millennium Institute, and I want to make a comment first because the Millennium Institute has been very involved in addressing many of these issues, participated in Rio Plus 20, and our president has been very involved in the discussions of the Sustainable Development Goals, promoting food security, which is related to the health and other issues. And one of the things that we're working on, we've developed a system dynamic model that integrates economic, social, environmental factors, generates longer-term scenarios that shows the effect of different policies. We were able to demonstrate with one of our country models how better coordination of the MDGs would lead to more rapid achievement of the goals at a lower cost. So it's a very useful tool, and we've worked globally with UNEP to show how globally this things can do. But we've got very intensive population demographics in the model. We've got climate change and have addressed in a number of countries. And we're working with the U.S. Institute for Peace to include more peace and security issues, which are more complicated to model because it's hard to quantify those things that happen. But with this kind of a model, we get and address many of the questions you were raising about an integrated approach and getting a clearer picture and bringing people together to show them the roadmap. Because once you see how all these factors interact and evolve over time, and the dangers from not taking any action for climate change and things like that, it helps bring people together. So I'm just curious as to what extent you think this could be useful in the kind of work you're doing, this kind of a modeling approach, or whether there are other models that you're using that do this integrated approach to see how we can achieve a better understanding of the very important issues you raised, and the data you provided was valuable.
Great, thank you. Please.
Thank you. I'm Mirza Shaukat Ali. I'm from Bangladesh. I work at the Department of Environment. Just wanted to ask the colleague from CAN that while considering the targets or the goals, you haven't mentioned you have mentioned every country will try to implement these goals, but I think UNFCCC considers CBDR, common but differential responsibility and respective capabilities. So I think if you don't consider this issue in fixing these goals, then maybe there will be some problem to achieving these goals, I think. And regarding suggesting the institutional frameworks and policy issues, I think UNFCCC is also advocating those issues at the UNFCCC, whether that will be a duplication kind of issues. And finally, UNFCCC is a very dynamic process, and having a very strong synergies among these UN is very important, because sometimes we see that UN cannot actually exert pressure on the UNFCCC process and then cannot implement or cannot influence the negotiation process. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So let's take these three questions and then we'll come back. So we have a question on conflict and GDP growth. And sort of maybe since you're sitting next to each other, is this an opportunity for a conversation in terms of developing the business case for cooperative engagement on contraception? A question about modeling and policy implementation. Have you thought of this as approach? How useful is that? How could this be further refined? Have you had problems with that? Are there constraints to that? It would be good to have a discussion on that. And then looking at CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility. What does that mean? And how does that link to the UNFCCC processes and the Sustainable Development Goals? And are there opportunities for more synergies across these processes? So, who would like to start? Genevieve, please.
Since at least one of them was a little easier, because all I have to do is repeat what I said before I can start. It's the stat was that countries with major violence had a 21-point higher poverty rate from the years 1981 to 2005. There's actually some interesting, I don't know if any of it's published, Jeff, you can answer this if it's published on USAID's website, but there's been some interesting sort of analysis of that statistic, because I think there's a lot of focus on it, and so it may be that they're overturning it as we speak in the Policy Bureau, but nonetheless, I think it's worth sort of, it makes the point and worth conversation further. I think certainly many of these things should be and can be relevant to the private sector as well. I will leave sort of the specifics of talking about to companies about contraception to my colleagues who know that considerably better than I do. But we have talked about, and the high-level panel puts this out, that every single goal and target that we talk about should have a robust global partnership kind of model with it, and some sort of platform for bringing in a number of actors on every one of these issues. So I think we should be building out the case on all of these things, and these kinds of statistics should be at the heart of it. And we should be pushing ourselves to make sure they're the right statistics. So I know Bill Sontag is on the statistics, like, commission-y thing that does this kind of stuff for post-2015, and I feel like that's what we need, is a lot of really smart statisticians who can push us to make sure that we're basing this on the right stuff, because it's very easy to make these kinds of determinations on values discussions and not on the basis of good evidence. So I think that's very important. So on that note, I'm sorry, I'm going to just go through them all since I have the microphone and we can pass it down. So I think that model sounds fascinating, and I would love to hear more about it. I think we're looking for exactly that kind of stuff. I think one of the things that's very good, and this is a slight difference of opinion, I think one of the things that's very good about having a year left to sort of sort through some of this stuff is that there are still things to be worked out. I think I get completely the conversation about not wanting to reopen the goals for the sake of having a lot of good things in there. I also think there's a lot of fluff in there, and I think that if we don't hold ourselves to higher standards to sort of deal with that fluff, then we might not be as effective as a globe on it. And I think one of the ways we do that is by continuing to build in as the best evidence we can, and I think that should come from everywhere. It certainly shouldn't just come from the US government and our analysts. We have good people, but we should get it from academia, we should get it from everywhere. And I think on that note, one other thing I would say to your sort of question about what is out there, I think we paid attention to that Wall Street Journal thing that just came out, and I think that was the Bjorn Lomborg piece, so Bjorn Lomborg, fascinating figure in general. Many people in the environmental community not huge fans, but he the effort that he is undertaking, I think, is a really valuable one. It's basically a cost-benefit analysis of the entire goal and target framework that's already been put forward to figure out kind of what's valuable, what we can do, what's sort of actually actionable. These are the kinds of questions we should be asking, and in my mind, we should be asking that because we've met with him and asked a bunch of questions to him, and that is an approach. a cost-benefit analysis is one approach to that prioritization question. We should be asking those prioritization questions in every single corner of our academic sphere that touches on these things. So we should have hydrologists looking at it and asking these kinds of questions. I mean, so I guess my point is that while that's one approach, we should have a complementary effort being done by sort of the environmental scientists within the National Research Council that can kind of pull together this. So going on and on, but the point is, I think we need exactly the kind of thing you're asking about, and we need to do it in a whole lot of different ways and probably pretty fast, because we're going to need to make these decisions very quickly. I will leave the UNFCCC conversation to my colleague, because obviously that's what he's doing. But I think one thing I would say on that front is that there absolutely have to be, for this to work in general, for us to be able to prioritize, we have to build on other processes, and we need to be able to sort of draw on the good work that's happening in the UNFCCC, on the good work that's happening in the ICPD. We can build on a lot of other processes that are out there. And in some ways, that's a way of prioritizing to ensure that these things are happening. You know, that's not to say we shouldn't be dealing with climate change in this. I don't think there's a single member state that thinks we shouldn't be dealing with climate change. I think we have argued, and many, many, many people have argued, that we build it into ag and water and energy and all of these fundamentally, because this is a fundamental issue and it has to be how we talk about it. But we also have to, we can't say, but this isn't legally binding, so let's throw a bunch of stuff in there that isn't achievable. I don't know that that's what you're saying. I don't think it is what you're saying. But I think we have to hold ourselves to rigor about what we put in the agenda on climate that we think we can achieve in order to, I'm very passionate about this because I have worked on climate amongst a number of people who aren't fans of working on climate change. And I think the way that you do it is to try and build it in, integrate it into other areas without, I think in some ways, sometimes without people even knowing it. I mean, I think we have built climate change as deeply as we can into how we talk about, into how we talk about each of these, I guess I'm already sort of repeating myself, but into how we talk about ag and cities and water and energy and peace and governance and everything. And we should be doing that, and we should keep doing that. And I think that we have to do it in a way that is as achievable as possible, or it's going to just be a bunch of statements that people don't pick up and don't do anything with. So.
Thank you.
So, agree with all of that, and maybe I'll take this gentleman's point first. Very interested in the models, and for 3 reasons. One is the WIFM principle, so what's in it for me, if people know that. That's how everybody looks at everything. Even, I went on and on about family planning. He went on and on about climate. It was really interesting. We're here to talk about integration, but when you start talking about your issue, you start foaming at the mouth, and that you're very narrowly focused. But what people need to understand now, and I think the zeitgeist now is such that people might actually understand this, is number 1, the ways in which each of these issues is a force multiplier for the success of the others. So if someone did the modeling at the economic analysis that showed how much less expensively we can tackle malaria, for example, if we address population growth issues and women's rights issues, if we address health systems, if we address climate change, which also hugely is impacting malaria prevalence and the forecasts for malaria. So I mentioned the word zeitgeist because of the universality of the goals, because of where we are with the internet and the media, because of the degree of scariness of what's going on in the world around Ebola and the conflict in certain regions of the world. There, again, no data for this, but clearly we are living in an era where we feel a shared sense of community around the world. And so I think now is the time more than ever that we can get away from the more siloed kinds of approaches. And then on a pragmatic level, I would suggest that those models are taken and to help the UN and those who are designing these goals to develop really smart, measurable measurements that also take this into account, because what is measured gets done. And so if we continue to have very goal-specific measurements that don't take into account the larger environment in which they operate, we'll just continue to have that kind of behavior. So that's something for us to think about.
We can do that, and we actually have malaria in the model, so we
Right.
can look at those questions.
Right, great. And then just real quick on this point, I think she was also asking about the very staggering stat that you had about how the degree of conflict leads to 30% 30-year reduction of GDP. Yeah. So So just the short answer there is it's the same as all the other arguments that we need to make. I mean, there are companies that invest in education, for example, and in STEM, so science, technology, engineering and math. Yeah, thanks. You know, every oil company invests, every energy company invests in that, even though they don't know which of those kids are going to come and work for them. You know, I would argue family planning is the same, but for some reason nobody is making that argument, and ditto for peace and security. So, you know, those who are in that industry focus on it very heavily, but no, there aren't actually, to my knowledge, companies that invest in preventing violence other than through the measures that we've talked about here, all of which are important to that.
Thank you. Etienne, anything you want to?
Yeah, just thinking, just last week we were sitting with staff members from the UN Environment Program and UNFPA, WHO, who were seeking stories like those that were shared and statistics to inform what will be the next piece of this process, which is defining the indicators. So the goals and the targets are critical to define the agenda, but really to measure any kind of success towards those targets will need some really rigorous indicators. And I think models like the one you mentioned will be critical to think about how to inform what those indicators will look like, whether they're building off of existing data or thinking about data in new ways to develop new indicators to measure that work.
Yes, sure. Just to clarify, I'm not saying we shouldn't open the document, but the number of goals. I think there's a lot of cleaning that needs to happen on the target level, and I think this is where there should be work. On the goals, I'm very hesitant opening because I think what we will end up afterwards is dropping the key goals and not the fluff. And this is where my concern. Maybe climate change, I don't know if you're hinting that climate change is part of the fluff, but I do think it's a key goal to have there. And yes, maybe in the US administrative departments, climate change is integrated everywhere, but I am from Lebanon. I live there. You know, I came here just for the summit last week, and I'm returning there on Wednesday. I can assure you, in most of the developing countries that I visit, climate change is a small niche like the butterflies and the birds and the tree that we need to protect. It's nowhere where it should be regarded. And putting it in the middle of the development agenda will send a strong message. Having a goal on it will create a lot of change that you need to have there. But I agree, there's a lot of fluff on the target level that can be worked on. And on what we can achieve, I think the goals will need to achieve. I'm not talking about, I don't think the goals should be 2030, but we should achieve them. For example, reaching greenhouse gas neutrality, we have to achieve it. This is the only way to win the fight against climate change. Otherwise, we shouldn't work on it if we don't think we're going to achieve that goal. That means we're not going to win the fight on climate change. Just like saying we shouldn't have eradication of extreme poverty goal because maybe we're not going to achieve. There must be someone that stays under extreme poverty around the world. You know, they have to aspirational and inspirational. The targets, I agree. The targets should be achievable, and this is where the work needs to happen. The goals have to inspirational and aspirational to provide a vision, a direction that we all go, such as zero nukes if we ever achieved it, or zero, whatever. These are concepts that have proven they're effectively in many areas. If we look at, for example, in waste management, when they put zero waste goals, such as City of San Francisco, their level of recycling and work on waste has surpassed all the numbers that many cities thought they cannot surpass. On CBDR, RC, I think in the post-2015 should be designed in a way that doesn't affect the principle of CBDR-RC, i.e., it shouldn't include numbers. That's why I said it shouldn't replicate things the UNFCCC is doing. There, they look at numbers. I look at the post-2015 process as an enabling process. So putting deadlines for low-carbon development strategies, doesn't say where they will go, what the numbers and these strategies should be, but each country needs to integrate climate change. It's in its national economic interest that they develop these goals and puts policies that would enable. Removing fossil fuel subsidies that are harmful is also in the economical interest of the country, and transferring them to direct support to poor communities. There are examples that showed this helps economically, since now most of the subsidies go to the rich people rather than poor people. So a lot of things that can be done that have win-win scenario, that things that you need to do in your own interest on your own. And yes, if you look at the UNFCCC where they address similar issues, it's under workstream 2 of the ADP, the Durban platform. That stream is different than the workstream 1 where they're going to be achieving an agreement in Paris. The workstream 2 is about enabling environment, and it's not going to be agreed outcome there. So it's similar to the post 2015 process. That's why having it in the post 2015 process, it's okay, because the discussions under workstream 2 addresses other issues elsewhere, such as the sustainable energy for all, such as IRENA, so that discussion is just to you can consider it as a valve to release valve to diffuse all the tension coming from the lack of trust among countries. So it's an enabling space as well. So I don't see it contradicting the UNFCCC.
Great, thank you. Let's take some more questions. Yes, please. We have a.
Hi, I'm Bill Sontag. I work for US EPA here in the building, actually. I'd just like to put a question and an observation. First, the observation, the communities are forming up globally to identify ways to support the goals and targets that have been articulated by the Open Working Group. And they're attempting to try and put together innovations and additions to national statistical capacity to measure the goals and support the indicators. I guess the question I have is, to what extent will that ability to support the topic, the goal, the target, the measurement, have an impact on the negotiations coming up in the next year?
Okay, great, thank you. Up front here.
I'm Sandeep. I also work in the building, and I think my first comment, I actually had 2 quick comments, is going to speak to what I do in the building, and that is that I wanted to point out that in Atiana's presentation, she mentioned Carolyn from Blue Ventures in Madagascar, and how she spoke last week about integrated population health environment programs in New York, and I just wanted to mention that she'll be here at the center on October 14th, and we'll be sending a public invitation out tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken, so stay tuned. And my other quick comment was just to build off of some of the corporations you mentioned in Indonesia, and I believe it was Bangladesh, yes, that's right, that are working on family planning with employees. I think Tata in India is also doing that as well. I learned about that in a study tour a couple years ago on a visit with SEDPA. So I don't know if that's still continuing, but Tata is huge, and so the significance of them being involved is big. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, I think there was a question here. Yes?
My name is Firoj. I'm from Bangladesh, and I have a little clarification. I'd just like to say from Genevieve. If I could remember, there was a slide on bubbles. Yeah, red and blue, blue for the Southeast and red for the Africans. And if you had a kind of projection about the red bubbles are getting bigger and the blue are getting smaller. So could you explain a little bit about what are the issues that you considered for, drawing this inference or projection? And based on those factors or issues, could you also tell a little more about what specific strategies that you perhaps have on mind to address those? Because it's very much understandable that in a very conflict-prone zone, other than maybe UN and some other international organizations, no private sector will come for investing in development.
Great, thank you. So we have 3 questions looking at the ability to provide innovations and support for statistical capacity and how does that impact negotiations, thinking about additional large corporations like Tata in India, and then wanting to get a better sense of what are some of the factors influencing conflict in Asia and Africa, and what are some of the strategies that come out of that. So why don't we start with you, Wael, and any final comments you'd like to make also?
Well, actually, for the question, I'm not sure if any of the questions were directly targeted to me.
No, but any final comments?
Any final comment? That's putting me on the spot, but I'll try just to say thank you for this opportunity, and I'm available if anyone would like to follow on CAN's work on post-2015 process. I think such discussions are important, so thank you for organizing it, and I think we should have more of it. There's a lot of tough year against us, and we need to prepare. I already have some ideas on who to reach out of the discussion today.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah. So to the questions. So I think that to the question about to what extent measurement is going to affect the negotiations and where we end up on goals and targets, I think we are all sort of waiting for that answer. I think our hope is that it will influence it quite a bit, and I think, honestly, I think the hope of many, many member states is that it'll influence it quite a bit. And I think that's the reason for having such a long stock-taking process, was that we were trying to build in those kinds of questions about what we know and what we don't know. And there was a lot of back and forth in the end game that was actually quite hopeful, that they would turn to the UN agencies that sort of owned these different issues and ask for the latest stats. So World Health Organization and others. And sometimes those weren't actually the organizations to turn to, but the fact that they were turning to them in the first, just because they aren't the holder of the latest scientific knowledge. But I think the fact that they were turning to them in the first place is a good sign. My hope is that it will influence it, because there are some areas where if you are building up the ability, for example, there's a learning metrics task force that's supposed to build up our ability to actually assess quality of education and not just the quantity of the number of people in seats. So that's going to be absolutely critical to the next set of goals. It might not be there yet by the time we start 2015, but the fact that that's underway strikes me as sort of meaningful in itself. If that's not underway, that's a question we have to ask ourselves. And I don't know how much that's, it's sort of just how do you predict how a political process is going to play out? I don't know how much it'll actually influence it, but I am hopeful because of what we've seen so far. So I think in terms of what goes into the projection about extreme poverty, that's strictly an income poverty number. There's been a pretty robust conversation around multidimensional poverty indices and ways of actually measuring other pieces of poverty. In that statistic in particular, that wasn't part of it. So this is just talking the kinds of projections that people are taking. What they do to make that projection is basically look at the poverty pathways and what kinds of changes have actually influenced the numbers over time. So largely that's based on economic growth, but they do factor in some, especially for conflict, when they look at kind of what has actually affected a poverty trajectory. And if you look at sort of changes in government that lead to it, they do some projection of that, but largely it's what have the trends been previously and how do we project those out forward. And most of them, when you sort of average them out, you get into this space that says the middle income countries where poverty is largely sitting now are probably going to, as they have over the past 15 years, be reducing their extreme poverty levels. At least there's still definitely poverty that we have to deal with, but reducing their extreme poverty levels because of the economic growth. And then in the coming time, those areas that have the hardest time dealing with it are the areas that are facing conflict. So that's sort of the theory that has been that is behind that projection, and it's based on just where they see trends previous and then sort of future. I think in terms of what to do, I think that's the million-dollar question that we're all struggling with as we try and pair the root causes of conflict with the targets that we put on the table and the things that we actually can measure. So the kinds of things are number of violent deaths. If you can, that's not as much a strategy as it is the kind of target, and you work backwards to the strategy. But you look at number of violent deaths, you look at access to justice systems. So we've been sort of arguing that that strong justice systems, that good police forces, which is a very tricky question politically, that these are the kinds of things that have been proven to make a difference in a country's sort of conflict or fragility. So we are kind of trying to put those things on the table, but we're also trying to surface others. So to the extent that people do have done these studies and can put them on the table to tell us what has the biggest impact in actually getting people out of poverty and conflict zones, I think every member state would be open to that. And I think, yeah, I would say just thank you so much for letting me be part of this. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I think these kinds of fascinating discussions are exactly why I have enjoyed working on this issue so much. And I think, especially sitting in a government seat, it's these kinds of conversations that are going to fuel kind of where we are ultimately. So I would say, please do reach out to us. Please do sort of keep us in these kinds of conversations as much as possible, because, it's the way we will get to success as a member state is to not just talk to ourselves or just talk to other member states, because there is, other member states are also bringing a lot of fascinating things to the table, but they're bringing a lot of fascinating things to the table that are reflections of their own politics, and we can, I think, grow a bit more in this process if we have a more robust conversation.
Okay. 3 super quick points, 2 in answer to the questions, and then a quick point and wrap up. On statistics, people at UN Foundation know that. I don't. Melinda, I don't know if you do, but I can report just 2 quick things. One is I know that the UNDESA, the UN agency that works on statistics, is doing quite a bit in this area and is doing capacity building exercises and so on and so forth. So I'm happy to bring that question to others and to get an answer for you. And I can reflect that we've been convening companies around the post-2015 agenda and how they can get involved and how they can support it. And I was very surprised to see that in meetings in both London and New York, the companies themselves said, this is something we know how to do. We know how to set goals and how to reach them. And so we would like to help in that process. So if there's a way that we can connect that intelligence with your office and the other offices working in this space, very happy to do that. It's a very important question. On Tata, that's great. There are the BSR, the really wonderful her project at the Business for Social Responsibility organization. They include family planning in their suite of healthcare programs for women. We just need to so it's included, but it's kind of slipped in the back door as opposed to something that a CEO is willing to step up and speak about. So if we can get the CEO of one of the Tata groups to talk about it, then we're winning. But thanks for flagging it, because Tata is a major global player. And then to wrap up, Project Everyone is an incredible idea that the director and screenwriter Richard Curtis has come up with. And the idea is that in addition to the negotiations that are going on at the UN level and on the global stage, and even in addition to the discussions we're having in rooms like this, it's time for everybody in the world to know and understand the significance of these goals, to know what they are and to know what it means to them. So his vision is to reach all 7 billion people on the planet in the 7 days after the goals are announced next year. Talk about aspirational. So we're trying to mobilize companies to help out with that, with their marketing reach and so on. But anyway, I just want to bring it up because, one of the other reasons the PHE work that you are doing was so striking to me was that people living in the communities that we're trying to help through goal structures like the SDGs, they know what they need and what they want. And so if they had a better sense of these goals and of what their countries have committed to, yes, they can not only help with the accountability, which is what everybody talks about, and hold their governments accountable to commitments that their governments make, but they can also participate, which isn't talked about enough. But I think that they can tap their own inner wisdom and their own sense of agency to also make a difference. And that applies to every single one of us. So that would be my concluding thought, that this kind of conversation needs to happen on a lot of different levels, but it's definitely the conversation to be having. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Just to speak briefly to the statistics question, I think that's a challenge that everyone's grappling. That countries like Kenya, who are devolving their power to the county level, are facing a whole new mapping of county level data that they have never yet been tracking, and tracking of data from various different years will continue to be a challenge globally. The UN Statistic Commission should be coming out with modalities starting in March, I think, for how to map out that process a bit more and what that roadmap will look like. I think we'll just all have to stay tuned, and certainly everyone's mindful of that. So yeah, thank you, Roger Mark, Sandeep, and my fellow panelists. This has been a really great discussion.
Great, thank you. So a huge thank you to Etiana for working with us to pull this together. So I'd like to pull out some common themes from the discussion and just reflect a little bit on the composition of the panel. So, from my perspective, we have an advocate who's working on advocacy, looking at integration, talking about SRHR. We have a funder who's looking at building partnerships and mobilizing others, looking at how we engage the corporate sector. We have a US government representative who is saying we need focus and talking about peace and governance. And we have a very powerful network representative bringing climate change to the table for us. So I think I was quite excited about the discussion today because of who was on the panel. Some themes that came out from our discussion today was one on integration. And it wasn't just integration in terms of the issues, whether it was peace in education or population health and environment or climate proofing targets under different goals, but also integration of processes that we talked about across the different UN agencies, but also looking at integration on these issues. And I think, so you called it the force multiplier. And sort of recognizing the importance of integration in that context. So that clearly for me was an important theme that came out of our discussion today. The second important theme for me was looking at who are the actors, who should be taking action, and how do we reach them. So we talked about government, we talked about multilaterals and multilateralism, we talked about the community, we talked about the corporate sector, and we talked about activists. We also talked about communication around these goals being aspirational and inspirational. We talked about making the business case, and we talked about Project Everyone. So there was this very strong communication element in reaching out to these key actors. And then the final theme for me that I thought was quite important was getting to the implementation of these goals. We talked about universality of the goals. We talked about the importance of having focus and determining what are the key issues to focus on and how, and they being difficult to focus on because they're transformative. And we talked about measurement and negotiations. So we covered a lot of ground. This was a wonderful panel, fascinating and important discussion. So please join me in thanking our panelists. We also have some very good resources on the table out there, some wonderful films and documentaries, so make sure that you get some of those, and then please also connect with us online, and our information is up there, and our panelists may be around for a few minutes, so grab them before they run away. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.